This is Christopher John Björknes. It is September 27th, 2023. My previous video on Einstein versus Poincaré was very well received, so I'm going to do one now on the principle of relativity. It was always very well known that Albert Einstein ripped off the principle of relativity from Henri Poincaré. He was accused of it throughout his career. He always refused to acknowledge that the theory of relativity was developed by Henri Poincaré, fully developed in 1905, before Albert Einstein ripped it off and published a paper on the same thing, plagiarizing verbatim Poincaré's work. And Einstein couldn't quite understand the fullness of what Poincaré had developed. Poincaré's theory was actually far more advanced than what Einstein published, as Minkowski realized. When Minkowski started to work on space-time, he built it on Poincaré's theory, not on Einstein's plagiarism of Poincaré's theory. And I'm going to prove that today by comparing what it was that Einstein wrote and when he wrote it side by side with Poincaré's prior and superior work. And it'll become crystal clear to you that Einstein had Poincaré's work in front of him when he was writing his paper. Actually, it was his wife, Mileva Maric, who wrote it and submitted it. And I'll show that to you. But I want to also demonstrate that it was always very well known that Einstein was a career plagiarist. I've written several books on the subject, proving Einstein's plagiarism and demonstrating with newspaper articles and primary historical sources that many people accused Einstein of plagiarism, that he always ducked the accusations and tried to hide from them and would never give Henri Poincaré due credit. And after Poincaré died in 1912, his friend Henrik Antoon Lorentz betrayed him and also tried to take a lot of credit for his work, but more so because he was politically aligned with Einstein, tried to give Einstein credit for what Poincaré had done. Lorentz, in that way, made himself famous because Einstein became very famous in 1919 after the eclipse observations, when he began to promote the Zionist cause. Einstein traveled to America in 1921 to promote the Zionist cause. In 1920, there were whole organizations built up to expose Einstein as a fraud and a plagiarist. And a great debate was held in Bad Nauheim, where the very famous Nobel laureate physicist Philipp Lenard demolished Albert Einstein. Here's Lenard. And Einstein became so flustered under Lenard's attack that he ran away during the lunch break and wanted to leave Germany and hide forever, but his press rescued him. Max Planck was a highly corrupt, though very brilliant German physicist who wanted to cover up Einstein's plagiarism, and he did a lot of corrupt things at this debate. They had armed guards with submachine guns at the doorway that prevented anyone who was not pro-Einstein from entering the hall and attending the audience. So they built up an Einstein claque in the crowd to cheer for Einstein. But even under all those conditions, Max Planck was obliged to call a break to give Einstein a chance to run away. And Einstein seized upon that opportunity and fled to the train station and wanted to leave Germany forever and hide forever because he knew that he had been exposed. And that was in 1920. Then he came to America after the press had saved him and made him very famous. Went to New York Harbor, was greeted by his fellow Zionists with great cheers of applause. But But the Americans were aware of what had occurred in Germany, and they knew that Albert Einstein was a plagiarist. And there were many scientists who pointed out that Einstein was a fraud. One of them was Arvid Reuterdahl of St. Thomas College in St. Paul, near Minneapolis in Minnesota. And he challenged Einstein to a debate, but Einstein wouldn't have it because he knew he would be slaughtered as he had been in Germany, and he didn't want his American trip ruined. So he hid from Reuterdahl. He claimed falsely that he had never heard of Reuterdahl, and then Reuterdahl proved that Einstein had heard of him and was a liar in addition to being a plagiarist. Another famous American scientist was Thomas Jefferson Jackson C., who likewise pointed out that Albert Einstein was a career plagiarist and a fraud. And Reuterdahl had several articles published in the local press in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, pointing out that Einstein's theory was bunk and he plagiarized it. And this is but one of many. I think there are dozens of articles republished in my book, The Manufacture and Sale of Sane Einstein, which you can find at my website, CJBBooks.com. A lot of the proof of his plagiarism is in my book, Einstein's Plagiarism of the Special Theory of Relativity. And all that history of those articles that Reuterdahl wrote and that were published about him is in my book, The Manufacture and Sale of Sane Einstein. I have several books covering Einstein's career of plagiarism. Please check out my website, CJBBooks.com. Reuterdahl called Einstein the Barnum of science, as in P.T. Barnum, the circus promoter. St. Thomas, Dean of Engineering, challenges German to debate. Einstein backed out of that and pretended he didn't know Reuterdahl. Reuterdahl cited Kenersha's work on the principle of equivalence between gravitation and inertia. And he also pointed out lots of others. He was in contact with people all over the world whose works had been ripped off by Einstein, and others who were simply accusing Einstein of being a plagiarist and having been anticipated by others. One of those others was that Kenersha guy, and Reuterdahl eventually became very well informed about Albert Einstein's plagiarism, and even the New York Times covered the fact, and they were very pro-Einstein, covered the fact that Albert Einstein was a career plagiarist, and that the charge of plagiarism, Professor Einstein gave no heed, but he did rush to the defense of his pet theory. Reuterdahl, of course, remained unconvinced. The New York Times in 1923, Reuterdahl kept at it all the way into the 1930s and participated in the book 100 Authors Against Einstein. This is from the New York Times. Sunday, June 3rd, 1923. Page 8. Einstein's predecessors. Dr. Arvid Reuterdahl argues German scientists used Soldners, that's the deflection of light by the gravitational field of the sun from distant stars. Soldner wrote about that, I think, in 1804, and he had a double Newtonian prediction, which was attributed to a mistake where he wrote 2G instead of just G, but he had the doubled Newtonian prediction, so he deserves credit both for Einstein's 1911 prediction and 1915 prediction for the deflection of a ray of light grazing the limb of the sun. Einstein copied exactly Paul Gerber's formula for the perihelion motion of Mercury, and Reuterdahl had learned about all that and exposed all that. Einstein's 1911 paper, the value of the deflection is given as 0.83, Soldner's value 0.84. The two formulae are identical. Professor Leonard of Heidelberg, Nobel Prize winner in physics, has pointed out that a factor of 2 was forgotten by both Soldner and Einstein in his 1911 value. But if Soldner's formula had the right data put into it, he actually gave the doubled Newtonian value in 1804. If Einstein's 1911 value of 0.83 is multiplied by this elusive factor 2, we obtain 1.68 of a second, which is practically identical with his abbreviated value, 1.7 of a second, divulged in 1916. Edward Guillaume was another who pointed out that Einstein was a plagiarist. Mr. Bond, Ziegler, Pelyagi, Kenersha. So again, it was very, very well known and well documented that Albert Einstein was a career plagiarist. He was accused of it to his face. He hid from it. He literally ran from it. And what he did instead of addressing the legitimate complaints against him was to insult and belittle his critics, and he had a press backing him up, which enabled him to do that. So we had Arvid Reuterdahl, Thomas Jefferson Jackson Say, the Bad Nauheim debate, where Philip Leonard destroyed him. So let's get into the actual proof that he ripped off Henri Poincaré's principle of relativity. Now, relativists like to pretend that Einstein was the very first human being to ever realize that motion was relational and that it was relative. But that's farcical. The ancients were very well aware of relative motion. They also had the idea of absolute motion, absolute position, and relative motion as a relational concept that became the principle of relativity of Newtonian mechanics. And Galileo was very well aware of that. And so let's look at what Einstein and his wife Mileva Marici wrote in 1905 as if it were something original and groundbreaking. Examples of this sort, together with the unsuccessful attempts to discover any motion of the Earth relatively to the light medium, the ether, which was thought to be quiescent, resting in absolute space, suggest that the phenomena of electrodynamics as well as of mechanics possess no properties corresponding to the idea of absolute rest. In other words, you cannot detect the rest frame of the ether. They suggest rather that, as has already been shown to the first order of small quantities, the same laws of electrodynamics and optics will be valid for all frames of reference for which the equations of mechanics hold good. We will raise this conjecture, the purport of which will hereafter be called the principle of relativity. They're presenting this as if it's something new, but it had been around for centuries. Christian Huygens, Leibniz, Mach, Stahlow, Ludwig Lange, several people had used the expression principle of relativity to mean exactly that there was no means of finding the state of absolute rest because the same laws of mechanics applied to things which were in rectilinear, uniform, translatory motion. In other words, things that moved in a straight line, traversing across equal spaces in equal times. We will raise this conjecture, the purport of which will hereafter be called the principle of relativity, as it had been for centuries, to the status of a postulate, and also introduce another postulate. And I'm going to prove that Poincaré called that other postulate a postulate and stated it before Einstein. So Poincaré stated both of the two postulates of the principle of relativity, the theory of special relativity, before Einstein, and Einstein copied them from him, which is only apparently irreconcilable with the former, namely that light is always propagated in empty space with a definite velocity c, which is independent of the state of motion of the emitting body. These two postulates suffice for the attainment of a simple and consistent theory of electrodynamics of moving bodies based on Maxwell's theory for stationary bodies. Larmor had already presented that, Lorentz had already presented that in 1904, and Poincaré had fully presented it with both postulates in 1905 in two papers which he published before Einstein, and which included his ideas of four-dimensional space-time, which Einstein and his friend Jacob Laub ridiculed for many years. They didn't mention Poincaré. Instead, they mentioned Minkowski's interpretation of Poincaré's four-dimensional theory without mentioning Poincaré. But Einstein opposed the idea of space-time. He did not propose it. He did not invent it. He did not discover it. He opposed it. Further on in the paper, it states on the relativity of lengths and times, the following reflections are based on the principle of relativity and on the principle of the constancy of the velocity of light. Those are the two postulates, principle of relativity, constancy of the velocity of light. They're presenting these as if they were new ideas. These two principles we define as follows. The laws by which the states of physical systems undergo change are not affected whether these changes of state be referred to one or the other of two systems of coordinates in uniform translatory motion. Any ray of light moves in the stationary or resting system of coordinates with the determined velocity c. That is only axiomatic if there is a quiescent ether at rest in absolute space, which is what the Einsteins believed in agreement with Hendrik Antoon Lorentz in 1905. But Poincaré had gone beyond that and said that there is no stationary ether. And Larmor had said that the ether was essentially simply a set of differential equations. With the and he said that in 1898. With the determined velocity c, whether the ray be emitted by a stationary or by a moving body. Hence, velocity equals the light path divided by the time interval, where time is taken in the sense of the definition in section 1. So there had always been in mechanics the concept of the principle of relativity, that things which are in rectilinear, uniform translatory motion obey the same laws of mechanics as things which are presumed to be at absolute rest. Augustin Privat du Chanel wrote much before 1880. This is an English translation that came much later. No experiments on forces and motions inside a carriage or steamboat which is traveling with perfect smoothness in a straight course. In other words, it's translating the atoms within it equal distances in equal times, will enable us to detect that it is traveling at all. We cannot even assert that there is any such thing as absolute rest, or that there is any difference between absolute rest and uniform, straight movement of translation. So even classical mechanics understood this principle of relativity. Professor J.D. Everett wrote in 1895, "There is no test by which we can distinguish between absolute rest and uniform velocity of translation." He had already incorporated that to electrodynamics and the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was thought to have proven through experimentation that it was impossible to distinguish absolute rest from uniform velocity of translation of relative motion. And therefore, the concept of absolute rest was thought by many to be a bogus concept. Galileo had written in the early 1600s about the principle of relativity of mechanics. It was often presented as an analogy to people in the cabin of a ship, and that everything, all the laws of mechanics would be identical for them as they would be for someone standing on the shore. For a final indication of the nullity of the experiments brought forth, this seems to me the place to show you a way to test them all very easily. Shut yourself up with some friend in the main cabin below decks on some large ship, and have with you some flies, butterflies, and other small flying animals. Have a large bowl of water with some fish in it. Hang up a bottle that empties drop by drop into a wide vessel beneath it, with the ship standing still. Observe carefully how the little animals fly with equal speed to all sides of the cabin. The fish swim indifferently in all directions. The drops fall into the vessel beneath. And in throwing something to your friend, you need throw it no more strongly in one direction than another, the distances being equal. Jumping with your feet together, you pass equal spaces in every direction. When you have observed all these things carefully, though there is no doubt that when the ship is standing still, everything must happen in this way, have the ship proceed with any speed you like, so long as the motion is uniform and not fluctuating this way and that. It's in a straight line, covering equal distances in equal times. You will discover not the least change in all the effects named, nor could you tell from any of them whether the ship was moving or standing still. That's the principle of relativity right there. There's no way to distinguish absolute rest from uniform rectilinear translatory motion, because the laws of physics are identical under both conditions. In jumping, you will pass on the floor the same spaces as before, nor will you make larger jumps forward the stern than toward the prow, even though the ship is moving quite rapidly. Despite the fact that during the time you are in the air, the floor under you will be going in a direction opposite to your jump. In throwing something to your companion, you will need no more force to get it to him whether he is in the direction of the bow or the stern. With yourself situated opposite, the droplets will fall as before into the vessel beneath without dropping toward the stern. Although while the drops are in the air, the ship runs many spans. The fish in their water will swim toward the front of their bowl with no more effort than toward the back, and will go with equal ease to bait placed anywhere around the edges of the bowl. Finally, the butterflies and flies will continue their flights indifferently toward every side, nor will it ever happen that they are concentrated toward the stern as if tired out from keeping up with the course of the ship, from which they will have been separated during long intervals by keeping themselves in the air. And if smoke is made by burning some incense, it will be seen going up in the form of a little cloud, remaining still and moving no more toward one side than the other. Now all of that changes should the ship be subjected to a net force that causes it to accelerate. But at rest and in motion, if it's uniform, rectilinear, translatory motion, the laws are the same. Henri Poincaré, in 1895, 10 years before the Einsteins published their paper, wrote, "Experience reveals an abundance of facts which can be summed up in the following formula. It is impossible to make manifest the absolute motion of matter, or more correctly, the relative motion of ponderable matter with reference to the ether. The only thing which can be observed is the motion of ponderable matter with reference to ponderable matter." So Poincaré is acknowledging the fact that the velocity of light is the same in all inertial reference systems, and therefore there is no means to find the preferred reference frame of the ether. And in many places, Poincaré said that the ether is a metaphysical delusion which is only utilized for convenience, and instead made reference to the fixed stars and other things in order to define these inertial reference frames. So that was the first postulate, and Henri Poincaré had stated it already by 1895. In 1898, in his article, The Measurement of Time, he wrote about the second postulate, the constancy of the velocity of light. But let us pass to examples less artificial to understand the definition implicitly supposed by the savants. Let us watch them at work and look for the rules by which they investigate simultaneity. I will take two simple examples, the measurement of the velocity of light and the determination of longitude. When an astronomer tells me that some stellar phenomenon, which his telescope reveals to him at this moment, happened nevertheless 50 years ago, I seek his meaning, and to that end I shall ask him first how he knows it, that is, how he has measured the velocity of light. He has begun by supposing that light has a constant velocity, and in particular, that its velocity is the same in all directions. That is a postulate. Again, the Einsteins copied his language and copied his postulate that light has a constant velocity, and its velocity is the same and in all directions and in all reference frames. That is a postulate without which no measurement of this velocity could be attempted. This postulate could never be verified directly by experiment. it might be contradicted by it if the results of different measurements were not concordant. In other words, it has to be the same in all reference frames, inertial reference frames. We should think ourselves fortunate that this contradiction has not happened, and that the slight discordances which may happen can be readily explained. Could not the observed facts be just as well explained if we attributed to the velocity of light a little different value from that adopted and supposed by Newton's law only approximate? So this is 1898. We already have in 1898 the two postulates. The laws do not change in a system of coordinates in uniform translatory motion relative to each other, and any ray of light moves in the stationary system with the coordinates determined by velocity c. So Poincaré anticipated the first one in 1895, which was already a postulate in classical mechanics, but he applied it to electrodynamics so that the velocity of light would also be the same in all of these systems, which would be contradicted by classical mechanics. And in 1898, he gave and called it a postulate, the postulate of the constant velocity of light. Then in 1900, this is an English translation that was published in 1902, but the original appeared in 1900. And now allow me to digress slightly. I must explain why I do not believe, in spite of Lorentz, that more exact observations will ever make evident anything else than relative displacement of material bodies. In other words, the reference frame of an ether cannot be detected as a preferred frame. All inertial reference frames bear the equivalent laws, and therefore a preferred frame cannot be detected. He was saying that in 1900, 5 years before the Einsteins copied it from him. No, it is necessary to find the same explanation for the two cases, and everything tends to show that this explanation would serve just as well for the higher order terms, and that the mutual destruction of these terms will be rigorous and absolute. And he is talking about the idea that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames. In 1902, in his book Science and Hypothesis, this is the English translation from 1905, but the original French was published in 1902. He stated, relative and absolute motion. Again, Einstein did not create the concept of relative motion. It was always understood by human beings. The principle of relative motion. Sometimes endeavors have been made to connect the law of acceleration with a more general principle. The movement of any system whatever ought to obey the same laws, whether it is referred to fixed axes or to movable axes, which are implied in uniform motion in a straight line. The Einsteins are copying this directly and exactly. This is the principle of relative motion. It is imposed upon us for two reasons. The commonest experiment confirms it. The consideration of the contrary hypothesis is singularly repugnant to the mind. Einsteins had read this. This was published 3 years before they wrote their paper. They used the exact same terms, principle of relative motion, and the exact same idea that the same laws apply to fixed and movable axes in uniform motion in a straight line. Then in 1904, in his St. Louis lecture, Poincaré stated explicitly, the principle of relativity, the exact words the Einsteins parroted, according to which the laws of physical phenomena should be the same whether for an observer fixed or for an observer carried along in uniform movement of translation, so that we have not and could not have any means of discerning whether or not we are carried along in such a motion. And the second postulate, the constancy of the velocity of light, was known from the Michelson-Morley experiment, and Poincaré, Lorentz, Larmor, Voigt, all the other people that were involved in the development of the theory of relativity referred to it frequently. There was absolutely nothing new or original about the Einstein's two postulates, and they expressed them as they were plagiarizing Poincaré primarily, but many, many other people had expressed the same things. Poincaré wrote in his brief paper in 1905. He also had the similar idea in his more complex paper, which was submitted in 1905, which laid out the theory of space-time. But this is from the simpler paper, which the Einsteins had certainly read. It appears at first sight that the aberration of light and other related optical phenomena would furnish us a means of determining the absolute motion of the earth, that is, its motion relative to the ether, rather than relative to the stars. There are no such phenomena. The experiments in which one takes account only of the first power of aberration have been unsuccessful, and one knows the reasons for that. But Michelson, having thought of an experiment in which one could measure effects depending on the second power of aberration, was equally unsuccessful. It appears that this impossibility of demonstrating the absolute motion of the earth is a general law of nature. So Poincaré had tied the two postulates together before Einstein, as had others. One of those others, and I was the first to point this out, was Henry Rowland, who wrote in 1899 both of the two postulates. And yet, however wonderful it may be, its laws are far more simpler than those of matter. This is referring to the wondrous ether. Every wave in it, whatever its length or intensity, proceeds onwards in it according to well-known laws, all with the same speed. The speed of light is a universal constant. Unaltered in direction from its source in electrified matter to the confines of the universe, unimpaired in energy unless it is disturbed by the presence of matter. However the waves may cross each other, each proceeds by itself without interference with the others. To detect something dependent on the relative motion of the ether and matter has been and is the great desire of physicists. But we always find that, with one possible exception, there is always some compensating feature which renders our efforts useless, and that was given as the Lorentz transformation. This one experiment is the aberration of light, but even here Stokes has shown that it may be explained in either of two ways. First, that the earth moves through the ether of space without disturbing it, irrotational motion. And second, if it carries the ether with it by a kind of motion called irrotational. Even here, however, the amount of action probably depends upon the relative motion of the luminous source to the recipient telescope. So the principle of Doppler depends also on this relative motion and is independent of the ether. The result of the experiments of Foucault on the passage of light through moving water can no longer be interpreted as due to the partial movement of the ether with the moving water, an inference due to imperfect theory alone. The experiment of Lodge, who attempted to set the ether in motion by a rapidly rotating disk, showed no such result. The experiment of Michelson to detect the ethereal wind, also carried to the extreme of accuracy, also failed to detect any relative motion of the matter and the ether. And this is exactly how the Einsteins began their paper, by showing that experiments hadn't done this. But Rowland anticipated them by 6 years and stated both of the postulates together to give a theory of relativity which precluded absolute space. Or precluded the possibility of detecting a preferred frame of absolute space. Relativists get pissed off if you don't use precise language. They're very dogmatic and mean-spirited people often, very clannish. It's really a weird kind of a cult that they've built up over the years. There was one other thing I wanted to cover before I close out. Christian Huygens, who wasn't that long after Galileo. Galileo lived from 1654 to 1642, and Christian Huygens wrote this probably sometime around, the 1670s. Very famous physicist, again, one of the great relativists, like Leibniz, like Mach, like Stahlo, like Lange, the true relativists. I'd like to point out that the theory of relativity is not a theory of relativity. It's an absolutist theory. The constancy of the speed of light is an absolute, not a relative. Events and intervals in space-time are absolute. Space-time is about as absolute as an absolutist theory can be, because nothing moves in space-time. So they can't even get the name of their theory right. But I digress. Christian Huygens, again, like Galileo, referred to a boat in uniform rectilinear translatory motion and a man standing on the shore exchanging pendulum bobs. In one of his works, he was a very prolific writer, and his works were well known, talking about a boat and passenger in that boat. You can go through, let's try to slow it down. You can go through and read this if you want, just to show that the principle of relativity was very well understood for hundreds and thousands of years, that Einstein can not claim to have discovered that there is such a thing as relative motion. In the notes to Huygens' work, it talks about the illustration of a moving ship is as old as the idea of relative movement in general. So whoever wrote these notes understood fully that it was an ancient conception, and that it was also often portrayed by the uniform motion of a boat as compared to a boat at rest or people standing on land. Here again, and this was, I think, published in 1903, it talks about the principle of relative motion. Relative motion. So there was nothing new about talking about relative motion in 1905. And all the hype built up around Einstein is a deliberate lie. They know they're lying to you. I think it was Herbert Dingle who talked about the fact that we have put ourselves in the hands of a class of scientists and historians who willfully and knowingly lie to us. And this is a tremendously dangerous situation. Yeah, it was in 1903, so 2 years before Einstein published about relative motion. So if you'd like to learn more about all these things, I highly recommend that you visit my website, cjbbooks.com. Check out some of my books. They are available in both paperback and as PDF files. The PDF files are much cheaper. I'd like to thank Mark and Caroline for contributing. Your contributions are extremely helpful. Thank you so much. If you'd like to donate, you can do so both in the links in the description below. There'll also be a link to my website, CJBBooks.com. And you can donate at my website or in the links in the description below. And I also have cryptocurrency where you can donate in that way. I want to thank you all so very much for watching. Einstein was a career plagiarist. He was openly accused of his plagiarism by the leading scientists of the world. They challenged him to debates. They destroyed him in a debate, and then he refused to ever debate again. So we really got to wonder, why is there this ridiculous promotion of Einstein? And why are all of these people in positions of great responsibility lying to us? And why have they been lying to us for much more than a century? It boggles the mind. It really boggles the mind. And they've been viciously attacking me ever since I started publicly discussing this. In the early 1990s, there's been an ongoing smear campaign to keep people from paying attention to what it is I've been saying. But even now, the Wikipedia pages and some newspaper articles and even some of the documentaries are starting to have to acknowledge the work of Poincaré, Lorentz. They still ignore David Hilbert, who had the generally covariant field equations of gravitation of general relativity before Einstein, as I and especially Professor Winterberg, proved. The list just goes on and on. Have a look at my books. You'll be amazed. I think everything that Einstein ever did of any significance, he copied from somebody else, and that can be proven with the primary sources, and in many instances, it can be proven that he had knowledge of those sources before publishing on it. He would often even just talk to people, and then after his conversation with them, just shamelessly rip off their work. I mean, shamelessly, word for word. And I found that many people, he would speak to them and he would say, explain your theory to me as if you were talking to a child in the simplest possible language. And so they would give them their thought experiments, and then Einstein would just rip them off word for word. Okay, I better stop now. Again, I thank you all for your contributions. Thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone who has watched. You've made it through to the end. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.